How's that?
Well done. Yeah, well done.
Okay. To give the Zangwell today. So Frank started his career doing a PhD in the Donders Institute in Nijmegen, where he used MEG. But I first got to know him when he was after that when he went to do a postdoc with Keir Nobre in Oxford, where he started working on working memory and its relation to action. In 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, he moved back to the Netherlands to start his own lab at VU Amsterdam. And he's here today to tell us about internal selective attention under the microscope of the microsaccades.
Yeah, that's the pun, exactly. Yeah. Thanks, Paul, for inviting me, and thanks everybody for showing up. So yeah, I'm going to talk about our research where the starting point of our interest has really been in the role of attention inside working memory. So, selective focusing on internal contents that we hold in our working memory for the purpose of guiding our behavior or actions. But I want to talk about how we've been able to use microsaccades, which are small fixational eye movements that I'll show you an example of in a minute, as a kind of way to track these processes of internally selected internal selective attention, or in other words, focusing on internal contents in memory. And the subtitle here is important as well because the focus of the talk that I chose, which is really just part of our general research direction, is on looking at eye movements to study internal selective attention. And until 4 years back or something, I had never really particular interest in looking at eye movements. And so this is really something that started a few years back when I was doing my postdoc. And we've been, as I'll show you in my talk, really been leveraging the potential of this initial discovery that we made on looking at microsaccades. And so I'll just be talking about a selection of studies of what we've learned so far. But I think maybe we're really at a starting point of opening up a wider investigation of the type that I'm going to show you. Feel free to stop me anytime or ask me questions. That's all right. So I thought I'll do this in 3 chapters. First, I want to show you what is it that I'm talking about. So I want to actually uncover that link or unpack that link for you between what I mean with internal selective attention and what I mean with microsaccades. So just to kind of get us on the same page. And then where I really want to go is to showcase how we've been able to use that relation that I'll show in chapter 1 to try to kind of get to the principles that govern internal selective attention. So really use the link that I'll show in chapter 1 as a tool to study interesting things about cognition. And then in the third part, which is relatively short, I want to make clear that if we're going to have all this kind of these microsaccade biases that I'm going to be talking about, then that has particular implications for when we're doing cognitive neuroscience research, where we assume fixation, but actually we don't have perfect fixation. And so I just want to tap on the implications these findings have for cognitive neuroscience. And we have done at least one study where we try to kind of really systematically study the relation between these ocular biases and neuromodulations that you get in particular cognitive tasks. Okay, so that's where we're going. That's the roadmap. So before I start, maybe so what are these microsaccades, right? So again, this is for me also relatively new. And I'm not in this game to study what microsaccades are or do, but more how we can use them as a readout of what's happening inside the brain when you're shifting attention in working memory. But anyway, so here's just a video I made of a participant we recorded the other day. Here's a fixation cross that is very typical in this kind of cognitive experimental psychology or cognitive neuroscience. And we ask people to keep fixation, right? And fixation cross is typically smaller than 1 degree visual angle. And so if we do careful eye tracking, this kind of fixation is an illusion because, in fact, what happened is something like this, right? The eye is constantly a little bit motion, and every now and then it actually shows these really tiny jumps, breaking fixation. Now that's slowed down. In reality, I showed you 3 seconds of data, I think, 4 seconds maybe. And if you want to see that again, you can here in the bottom, I'm just tracing the velocity of the eye position. You can clearly see peaks whenever there's a sudden jump. you can see here. And so these are these kind of microsaccades that I'm going to be talking about. So people don't keep perfect fixation, even though we instruct them maybe perhaps to do that. So what are these microsaccades? So there's a class of fixational eye movements, right? When you keep fixation, your eyes still move. And there is tremor and drift, which are a type of fixational eye movements, but there's also these real saccades, and they just happen to be very small saccades. Typically, they're below 1 degree visual angle, but might really depend on our setup. But in the kind of experiments that we do, these microsaccades tend to be really quite small. And they happen to be co-occur in both eyes, just like regular saccades. But maybe unlike regular saccades, that perhaps serve to kind of fixate new objects, like I look at one person to another person to another person, these microsaccades occur even when we're attempting to keep fixation on the same position. So, for example, a fixation cross in an experiment or a particular object. And so, that might be a functional difference. And we also know from beautiful neurophysiological work that similar or perhaps even the same oculomotor circuitry in the brain is involved in generating saccades and microsaccades. So, for example, the superior colliculus has been shown to be a key hub in the brain that is necessary for generating these microsaccades, just like larger saccades. So that's what I just wanted to say about before I kind of go back to my talk. So let's go to chapter 1 and try to uncover this kind of link that I'm going to be talking about. So a little introduction here. We know that the brain contains the oculomotor system, which comprise of many areas, but two of the key hubs in this areas is the frontal eye fields and superior colliculus. And these are involved in shifting our gaze around and looking at different places. But a lot of research has shown that the oculomotor system in the brain also participates in shifting our covert attention around without overt big saccades at least. And so, for example, we know the frontal eye field is a key node in what we call the dorsal attention network, just giving you a rundown of some of the evidence. That when you make eye movements, that attention automatically shifts even ahead of the eye movement, right? So you can see facilitated perception at the target of your eye movement before your eye actually has started to move. We know that you can causally kind of get attention-like facilitations of visual processing by merely stimulating the frontal eye field in the correct location. So they kind of suggest a causal contribution of the oculomotor system to visual attention. And likewise, you can inactivate certain areas, including, for example, superior colliculus, and get selective deficits in visual spatial attention. And so I would say it's well established that the oculomotor system not only controls where we look overtly with our eyes, but also where we shift our attention covertly. But of course, in the external space of perception, these things are kind of naturally linked, because I might be looking at Paul, but covertly in my attention, something happens there that attracts my attention. And if that's interesting enough, I might look at it carefully and make a real eye movement. So it makes sense that the same brain circuitry is engaged in overt and covert attention. But of course, I'm talking about shifting attention among the contents of working memory in this particular talk. And so here, this kind of natural incentive of a link with overt eye movements kind of breaks down, because in memory there's not necessarily something to look at. And so one could ask or pose the question, and I should say this is a bit retrofitting the question after we discovered this data. But anyways, it does give a bit of context for maybe why we found what we found. Whether the oculomotor system in the brain also participates in shifting attention around among internal representations held in working memory. So we developed, I'm not sure, but we employed this very simple but kind of carefully crafted laboratory task to study internal selective attention or internal focusing. And so in this task, and I'll show you many variants in my talk, the basic ingredients are that participants have two visual objects or items, however you want to refer to them, that they have to encode in their memory, right? They have to encode them in their short-term memory or working memory. In this case, there are two colored bars that have different color and different orientation. They have to hold them in working memory for a period of, let's say, 1 or 2 seconds or 3 seconds for a short amount of time, until we cue through the color which of the two items they need to selectively access in order to guide their behavior. In this particular case, they have to report the orientation of the color matching item, so that the fixation cross turns into purple. Then they have this purple and green representation in their memory, the two objects that they hold in mind. and they have to select the purple representation because they have to report the orientation of the purple representation and not of the green representation. Does that make sense? So after the cue, after the fixation cross changes color, you have to select an internal representation for guiding your behavior. And that's the process that we've been interested in. Now, 3 key points before I show you the eye movement data is that the fixation cross is the central color change of the cue is the central color change of the fixation cross. So there's nothing spatial in the cue, right? Then the report that people do happens around fixation. So even though we're cueing them the purple item, which happened to be on the left and encoding, the report actually is just about the orientation and do that around the fixation cross. And also, mind you, that we never ask people if it was the left or the right memory item. That's totally incidental to the task. The only thing you need to remember is the color and orientation of the 2 items, regardless where they are on the screen. Okay? And so when we looked at eye tracking data, which again, originally we were looking at eye tracking as a control signal for an EEG experiment where we were interested in something different, but we measured eye tracking anyways, like I guess many of us do. When we're looking at eye tracking, and we looked in this period after the selection cue, separately for trials where the selection cue corresponded to a memory item that happened to be on the left or happened to be on the right in encoding, so item left and item right here, we see that people are keeping perfect fixation, right? As you can see here by these heat maps of where people are looking. So the items used to occupy this space, and we're looking at a relevant period after the selection cue, and it looks like people are keeping perfect fixation. So why wouldn't they? Because there's nothing on the screen to look at. We don't ask you about where something was. Your report happens centrally, etc. Now, critically, if you look at the same data in a slightly different way, so what we're just going to do is going to subtract what is common to these 2 maps and look at basically the relative differences between queuing an item that used to be on the left, it used to be on the right. Then you can see that actually hidden in those general heat maps, there is actually a highly reliable, turns out to be very small, but very reliable biasing of gaze position in the direction of the focused memory item. Okay? So if you're focusing on the item that used to be on the left, gaze density is on average higher in the direction towards the left, not at the location of the item, but in that direction. Whereas if you're focusing on the item on the right, the gaze is shifted towards the right. Okay? Is that clear? So that was just looking at gaze position. So later we've been able to show that this effect is driven by microsaccades. So what's shown here is not gaze position, but this microsaccade rate. So these gaze shifts, you can identify them based on their velocity profile, as I showed at the beginning. And then you can just, every time you detect the gaze shift, you can just call it a 1, and if you don't detect one, you call it a 0, and then you can quantify basically the rate of saccades as a function of time. So what you can see here is the rate of saccades after, as a function of time after the color change at the central fixation cross, and as a function of whether they are going to the left or right, and whether the memory item that you're focusing is also left or right. So then you have saccades that are toward the focused memory item or away from it. Yeah? Make sense? And so after the cue, you get an initial little dip in the saccade rate, but then critically, from around 200 milliseconds to about 600 milliseconds after the cue, most of the saccades that you make in this interval are in the direction of the focused memory item and not away from it. Now, how do we know these are microsaccades? Well, we repeat this analysis looking at the rate here, now color-coded, but as a function of the saccade size. So every time we detect a saccade, it could be small or big. And so now we stratify the data based on the saccade size, and this is in percentage. 100 is where the item was, the center of the item, which is here at 5.7 degree in our experiment. And so if people look sometimes towards the item location, then we will see some sort of green blob here, but that never happens. In fact, what we get is that these saccades that are on average below 1 degree visual angle, they are the ones that significantly more towards the focused memory item than away from it. Okay. Now, it's a very small effect because they are microsaccades, and that's why it's very small. But once you know how to quantify it, it's actually very reliable. So here's from that particular experiment, the 24 subjects where we had usable eye tracking. And you can, and they're sorted by how clear the effect was, or something like that. But basically, you can see in every subject, you can see this kind of green blob showing more saccades toward than away. And in most subjects also is really in the range of the microsaccade range. Yeah. So, once we know what we're looking for, actually it's quite easy to find. Now, before I continue, because I'm in chapter 1 trying to showcase to you that shifting your attention among memory contents is associated with these microsaccade biases. This idea is not completely new. It is related to other things in the literature, but I think it's also distinct in certain ways. So, first of all, people have shown during long-to-memory retrieval mostly, and also visual imagery, that there is this kind of looking at nothing behavior, where you go back to locations where previously locations previously occupied by certain memory material or material that you try to imagine, you're kind of going back to those locations. Here are some references of that type if you're interested. But critically, we don't show that you're going back to the location. We show microsaccade bias. You're not using the location as a kind of retrieval cue by making an eye movement there. Instead, your eyes are kind of slightly biased in the direction of the focused memory item. Now, people have also shown that kind of thing during kind of a Posner-like cueing paradigm. But this is typically in the context of perception, where there is actually an item that you might be able to look at. And again, this goes back about more than 20 years, or if not more. But the difference, of course, we're showing this in memory when there's actually no incentive really to look at all at the memory item. Or at the stimulus, if there is no stimulus. Okay, so the question then is what the bias buys us, right? So what? We have this microsaccade bias. So first of all, I think from a more theoretical point, shows what I was introducing earlier, that the oculomotor system inside our brain is not only there to control where we look, might also be there to control our covert attention and even control where we're shifting our attention among internal representations, at least held within this kind of spatial layout of visual working memory. And shows also that that kind of action circuitry in the brain is not only there for action, but it's also there for things that we would consider very cognitive, such as selective memory access. But from a kind of beside this theoretical point, from a more practical point, it also buys us a means to track internal attention. This is what I promise you I will spend most of my time talking about. And of course also a non-invasive kind of readout, if you will, of oculomotor brain circuitry, such as the superior colliculus, although of course very indirect. And this kind of tracking has both good time resolution, because we can measure these eye movements as they occur in real time. So the eye tracker goes at 1,000 hertz, just like an EEG recording. It's not that you make saccades at 1,000 hertz, but at times when you make saccades, we can measure kind of instantaneously. And also in space. It allows us to ask interesting questions about spatial coding, the way we use space to organize our memories, which is a topic in and of itself. But this particular measure allows us to ask interesting questions about how we're using space for memory. And I'll show some examples of how we've been able to use this measure both to track things in time and in space. Okay, so that brings me to my second chapter. I'm happy to take any questions on the basic premise of what I just showed you, in case there are any. Yeah.
When you showed all the individual differences with microsaccades, you said sort of 1 degree of microsaccades, but some of those subjects looked a lot more than that.
Yeah, so
there's some subjects that are actually making saccades.
Yeah, I mean, well, making really saccades to the original location of the memory item would be here in the top of our plot, like this line here indicates where the items were, at least the center of the item. So nobody does that, but there is indeed participants that do this, which either mean that they have relatively big microsaccade, or our calibration was a bit off, or quite off, maybe in this particular case. Like if but even our calibration is off, I think the eye movement size itself would still be kind of accurate. Yeah, it's an interesting question. And in this subject, for example, we count as a subject doesn't have much, but if you look here really down there, it's a very clear effect. It's just like super small. So, but of course, the smaller they are, the harder it is for us to detect them as really saccadic events as opposed to noise. So, yeah. But I think we still need to leverage this measure to also look at individual differences, which we haven't. But I'll be quite keen to do that in the future. Anything else? No? Okay. So, here I am talking about how we've been able to utilize this measure to study interesting properties or principles of selective attention, at least within the context of our task. Now I don't really have, because the way I set up this talk, I don't really have much time to introduce each and every one of these studies. I just want to give you a flavor of some of the type of things we've been doing. But fortunately, the paradigms that we've been using is very similar to the one I just showed you. So first, at some point we asked, like, what's actually the source of driving your attention shift to the correct memory item? Because there's at least two possibilities here. So you have this in memory, and then the fixation cross changes color. Which could be, well, the fixation cross changes color because it's telling you, and it's telling you that that's the correct memory item that you're going to need to report either right now or after another delay. And so there's kind of a goal-driven, there's a reason for you to pay attention to the purple memory item. But of course, there's also something that you might refer to as stimulus-driven, which is the fact that this thing is purple might be enough to automatically trigger your attention to the whatever is in memory that's also purple. And so it might be some sort of like stimulus-driven component to that. And so, but how are we going to distinguish the two, right? So we took kind of inspiration from this thing is known as the anti-saccade task, where we developed this anti-retro cue task, where in this case you get a retro cue here that tells you, in different blocks, tells you different things. So in some blocks it tells you what it normally tells you, that that's the memory item you're going to need, and you can at that point drop the other item, and then later you're just waiting for the second retro cue, or in this case we call it the probe, and then you make your report. You report the purple item. But then critically, we have different blocks where the retro cue is 100% anti-predictive. So now it matches the color of one memory item, but your task is to, at the end of the day, report the other memory item. So you see this cue, and then you will always be probed about the green item. So the goal-driven attention should go to the green item, but a stimulus-driven attention might go to the purple item. And then we have another type of block where it's 50-50. So you should just supposed to ignore the cue. It doesn't give any predictive value as to which item is going to be probed. Yeah. So there's also interesting behavioral data in this experiment, but I'm just going to show you the gaze patterns that we found. So first, when the cue is uninformative, and this uninformative for the whole block, and it says on the screen that it's uninformative, and we tell you that it's uninformative. Nevertheless, you get a little bias in gaze here after the cue towards the color matching memory item, suggesting that the color might actually be sufficiently potent to trigger your attention to the matching memory item. But when the cue is informative, that effect is 3 times as big or so. So it suggests that it's not just the color matching one memory item, it's also you wanting to select that memory representation in order to guide your behavior. And then, of course, what's going to happen when the cue is anti-predictive is these two processes are initially going to cancel each other, and then ultimately, hopefully, you end up with the correct memory item, and that's exactly what we found, right? So initially, you go a little bit towards the color matching item, which here will give you negative towardness because it's plotted relative to the relevant memory item. But eventually, you realize where you should go, and then with some delay, you end up with the correct memory item, and your eye is still going. Okay. So we've been able to track this kind of competition happening inside your memory by looking at these eye movements, or in this particular case, the gaze position bias. Okay, that was one example. Like I said, I'm kind of quite brief about my examples, but I hope you get the sense of how powerful this might be. Yeah.
Maybe just a detail, but the timing of that one was like super long compared to the 300 milliseconds having your. Is that?
Yeah. So there is a difference. Yeah, what happened is that when you do the saccade level analysis, so you actually look at the gaze shift, which is just you shift or not, then that's quite punctate in time. But this is just the gaze position. So if you shift and then stay there for a while, then your gaze position kind of accumulates for longer than the shift itself is only transient. So here we're looking at gaze position. Yeah, sorry, I mix older and newer studies, so it's a good point. Yeah, I didn't specify that. So if you did the gaze shift, that would actually be, again, between 200 and 600 milliseconds. Kind of, yeah. Okay, so this one is one of my favorite studies, I think, that we've done using this measure. Because here we're interested in the timing of attention switches relative to sequential memory-guided behavior. So again, the task is kind of the same. But we change another critical variable in the task, which is that we're going to now have you report both items, but we're just going to tell you in which sequence. So it's a very simple tweak, but as you'll see, it's quite effective. And so here you have 2 items again in memory. We queue one of them, and that's basically the one you're going to have to report first. But you cannot drop, in this case, the green item because you're going to have to report that second. And so the interesting thing that this paradigm or this kind of version of the task gives you is that, first of all, now you're really prioritizing an item, not selecting one and dropping another. You're really saying, this one I need to prioritize, but I can't forget about the other one. And the second thing is eventually you're going to need to switch your attention from the one item to the other item. Okay? And as it turns out, we can even track the switch here in this eye movement signal. So first, after this initial cue, even though now you cannot drop the green item, you can only prioritize the purple one because you need it first, we can still measure the gaze bias. It's bigger, I can tell you, I don't show it here, but it's bigger if you can drop the other item, we had the control condition, then the effect is about 1.5 times to 2 times bigger. But the point is that it's still there, right? So prioritizing an item over another item temporarily also is enough to drive this bias. But the more interesting is what happens relative to the switch. So participants dial up the orientation of the first item with the computer mouse. It takes them about 1 second on average. There's some sometimes faster, sometimes slower, but it takes about 1 second. And then when they finish, they have to click the button of the mouse saying, that's it, that's my report. And then we impose 1 second delay before they can even start reporting the second item. And so intuitively, if you're going to lock the data here to the moment that they finish reporting the first item, you would think that their attention lingers with the item that they're reporting first until they finish with it, and then they're going to start shifting to the second item that they're going to need in a second from now. But it turns out that's not what we found. What we found was this. So the gaze signal here that is lingering on the purple item starts shifting towards the green item about 600 milliseconds before they finish the report of the purple item. And in fact, by the time that they finish the report here upon the button click, it seems like they have already shifted to the green item that they're going to need to report second. And again, this wasn't the case if they had to report the same item twice. In this case, the gaze bias would just kind of linger to here and then kind of drop to baseline. So suggesting here that the brain is kind of looking ahead to the next thing it's going to be needing to do while still engaging in the current. And this is known from the literature on kind of perception action, that you kind of look ahead to the next thing. Like if I'm building an IKEA furniture or something, I might be screwing in the leg of the table, but while I'm still doing that, I look at the instruction manual to see what's my next step, right? So I'm kind of 1 step ahead of the game. And kind of suggest here that this also happens among the contents that are exclusively in memory. And again, that we can actually read this out from this external gaze signal. Okay, so here's another example where this time we're not so much interested in the timing of the attention switches, but the use of specific spatial frames for holding things in working memory. And so what we did as a starting point is turn this task into a VR task. And we have a VR setup that has eye tracking. This is the Vive Pro Eye that I believe you also have in your lab. Maybe other people here in the room have it as well. This is work led by Dan Brashkov, by the way, who's still at Oxford. So first we implement our task in VR. We deliberately kind of keep it simple and very similar. Now these objects are 3D floating kind of tubes, but apart from that, it's kind of the same thing. And you're reporting using a controller. You just kind of, like I'm holding this thing, you kind of just report the orientation and click. Okay. So our first question is whether we can at all still measure the same thing when we go to a kind of a virtual 3-dimensional setup where you have no chin rest and nothing like that. And the good news is, yeah, we can clearly still measure this, right? So here's the horizontal gaze position, this case expressed in centimeters. And you can see trials where the items were on the right or left. On average, these things are about 1 centimeter away, 1 meter away, so 100 centimeters. So the bias, again, is very small. It's like 1/100th of the size of where the items were. But again, it's very reliable. You can also see the arrow bar here. It's like really quite, you can really capture this thing quite well. And again, showing the fixational nature of the bias. Here is showing it projected on the fixation cross, kind of gaze density, where the gaze density differs most between trials where we cue you about the item that happened to be left at encoding, so the blue one here, or the right item, the red one here. And you can see that difference is kind of, happening around fixation. So we can measure this in our virtual reality setup, which we thought was cool. But then we thought we can do something interesting. We can ask the participants to rotate 90 degrees, this case, and then ask which spatial frame they're going to end up using for selecting the memory item. So I can also demonstrate here. So I guess if Paul was to my right and one of you, Tristan, I guess, is to my left, then you are my two memory items. But after I turn 90 degrees, both of you are to my left. But you're still to the right of him, right? So there's two spatial frames here that I potentially could be using, which is where are these items relative to where I am currently looking, or where are these items relative to each other, right? And so here's how it looks. So we had participants see the items, then they turn 90 degrees, and then we cue them about one item. And we had people turn left and right and cue them about the left and the right item. So they're kind of 2x2 design where we can try to look at which spatial frame participants are using, if any at all, because the effect might break down at this point. Like we don't even ask you where the thing was in the room. So maybe after we get you to rotate 90 degrees, we will just kind of kill the effect. But turns out we still get it. Yeah, this is what I was just saying. So you have this kind of two spatial frames. You can think about it more as allocentric. We call it the internal content frame. It's like where the item is relative to the other item. But also there's this external environment frame, which you can call egocentric, I guess, a world center or something like that, which is whether the items are to the left or right of where I'm currently looking. And to make a long story short, because we did 6-7 experiments, I think, during the pandemic when the labs were closed, and it took a long time. But the answer was actually use multiple spatial frames. So through this eye movement bias, we could actually see a bias both in this internal content frame, whether the item was left or right of the other item, but we could also see a bias, particularly when the task was more difficult, as here in a load 4 situation, in the frame of like where the items are relative to you in the world. So suggesting maybe that your memory doesn't rely on one spatial frame always. Maybe it relies on multiple spatial frames at the same time. And I guess you have some interesting work with the landmark that we were talking about earlier that maybe suggests the same thing. Okay. Make sense? So I have another example which actually happens to show convergence, a similar kind of principle of maybe not always relying on one spatial frame, but perhaps multiple. But the setting is quite different. So in this case, we don't have the participants move, but the items, or at least this is kind of the items themselves don't move, but there is this kind of future rule. Okay, let me try to explain this. So you have two items, and let's say they're encoded on the top and the bottom. In other trials, it could be left and right, but in this case, in this example, they are top and bottom. And then in this block, there is this future rule that dictates that if the green item will be tested, it will be tested by a probe item that will become on the right of the screen. So green item is encoded on the top, but tested on the right. And purple item is encoded on the bottom, but tested on the left. Okay? But then there's different future rules in different blocks. So the item kind of move in different ways in different blocks. Now, at test, we present two gratings. And you know which one is your target because you know that you were queued for the green item, and the green item will be tested on the right. So now you have to, this green thing is not there in the experiment. Now you know that you have to compare the orientation of this thing to the orientation of the item that's now presented on the right. And you have to say if it's clockwise or counterclockwise. Okay? And our question is kind of simple. When you queue now the green item, are people going to care about where they last saw the green item, so the past location? Or are they going to care about where they actually need this representation, so the future location? Because you can imagine that you see this, but you remap the information to where you're going to need the information. And so even when we queue the item, you might already remember that on the right and no longer at the top. An alternative scenario is perhaps that you remember it at the past location until you can select one, and then you kind of think about the future location, so it's kind of serial. But actually, here's what we found. Now there is a gauge shift rate on the y-axis, so this is the saccades. This is a more recent study. First of all, we lock it to the saccade, to the past location. So this is now looking at saccades happening more in this particular trial to the top and to the bottom, but in other trials will be more to the left and to the right, etc. We have all combinations. We can see that participants haven't forgotten the past location. In fact, their eyes are still biased by the past location. But so then we ask, okay, do they also care about the future location? And if so, when, right? And so turns out that more or less at the same time, not so much in series, participants are also, their saccades are also being biased by the axis in which the memory item will become tested. So in this case, the saccades will be biased both to the top and to the right. And it's not first to the top and then to the right, but really kind of happening in parallel. And in fact, I don't have the slide here in the main talk, but we were able to show that the single trial level individual saccades are really biased in both dimensions. So and it relates to the VR study because it's showing that in the VR study, you might use both allocentric and egocentric kind of reference frames at the same time to store your memories. And this suggests you might also use frames with regard to both the past and the future location. Yeah. I think I have one or two more examples, and then I'll go to my final part.
Just a quick question from the previous one. The moment you've given your cue, the green one, there, that means that you can see the microsaccades going up and side, up and side?
No, to the middle of the two.
Okay, so it's not like a split in the
No.
session. It's literally some sort of weird
Yeah, it seems. Yeah. So if you have two priority maps, if you will, in spherical equilus, then the saccade might go to the vector average, kind of. That's kind of. Yeah. The important point for us was that the single trial level saccade help us separate two different scenarios. It could be that some people or some trials you go to the past location and some others you go to the future. But there is no two maps at any given moment. There's just like one map. It just mixes in the averages. But actually, within the given subject, within the given single trial, the saccade is really biased in both dimensions, suggesting that you really have a joint activation of these two maps. Yeah.
I also have a question about the task, because you said you're not going to talk so much about the behavior, but are these only from correct trials, or?
No, they're all trials, but but we did do that, I think, and the correct trials, I think the past trace is the same, doesn't matter if you're correct or incorrect, but the future trace, I think, is a bit stronger if you're also correct or something. Okay. Yeah, because the way we set up the task, if you forgot about the future rule, for example, you're going to end up incorrect in half the times because you're going to pay attention to the wrong target. Okay? Yeah, this is a very recent one that we also did. You can see we are still at the stage where we're creative with the things we think we can address with this measure. Maybe in a few years' time we'll run out of ideas, but hopefully not. But anyway, this is another version. Oh, by the way, I'm always showing you this task with bars. It doesn't matter. We've also done it with real-world objects or color patches, or you can measure the same thing. Anyway, here's a version that personally I think is also quite interesting. I call it efficient coding. You have a very different connotation of efficient coding. It's not what I mean here, but I'll get to what I do mean. So here we have the same task, basically, right? But what we do is we have now kind of 4 types of trials. In this type of trial, there's 2 items on the screen, okay? And they could be close or far away. So they are near or far. But at the end of the day, maybe all your brain care about is whether it's the left or the right memory item. It doesn't really care where it is. Because also don't forget it's in memory, right? So maybe it doesn't really matter so much where the items were. But to keep them separate from each other, you might still care about that this thing is to the left of that thing. But in this case, we call that the direction sufficient condition. Direction is in principle enough to get to the correct memory item. But in this case, direction is insufficient. Why? Because there's now 4 items on a row. And so now we can still cue you about an item here, the cue here, that is near or far. So in that sense, it's exactly the same as we do here in the top row. Except knowing that it's towards the left is not helpful because you need to know that it's to the left and near, or to the left and far. So it's like you see what I mean? So there's competition in the direction. And so kind of in a way, our question is whether covert selective attention as measured out through these eye movements operates any different when the direction is sufficient or insufficient. And it turns out, yeah, it's quite different as derived from our measure at least. So here is the data and the direction sufficient condition. So here's a spatial gaze bias. In this particular case, it's in degrees in gaze position again, I think. Yeah, it is. Separately for trials where the items were near or far. And because of fixational eye movement bias, maybe it doesn't care, and in fact it doesn't care. And here's the heat maps of where people are looking differently for left and right trials. And so the items here were 3 and 6 degrees, so they're not looking again at the item, it's just a fixational bias of like the item is left or right, and that's all I care about. But the critical insight is here what happens when the direction is insufficient. So even though it's still a fixational gaze bias, again, people are not looking towards 6 degrees or 3 degrees, they're just looking a little bit in that direction. The bias becomes about twice as big when they're selecting the further item as opposed to the nearby item. Okay? And you can kind of see that quite clearly here as a clear interaction in the effect. And so we call this efficient coding because it suggests that the brain only care about distance when it needs to care about distance, at least here in memory, because in this case it doesn't need to care about distance, it just needs to care about direction. But here direction is not enough, so it needs to care about distance, and then we can actually measure that it does care about distance by looking at these eye movement biases. Okay. Now, before I go to my last part, I just wanted to show you, I've been talking about selective attention inside working memory, so maybe my talk is really more about selective attention than about working memory, although we studied it in the context of working memory, which may be interesting. But we've also been able to show recently that these microsaccades are not only there when you're selecting a specific item, but they're also biased in the maintenance period. So we did a very simple manipulation. It really doesn't get much more simple than this. We just presented the items in different spatial configurations. So they are like horizontal, vertical, or two type of diagonal. So that's where the items are going to be. These white circles are just like where they could have been in different trials. And then we're just going to count in the memory delay, for how long the microsaccades, or if at all, and for how long the microsaccades are going to be biased along the axis of where the memory items are, when you don't yet know which of the two memory items you need, but you're just holding both items in mind. And so here is across the full retention interval, this is 3-second delay interval, the distribution of saccades, and most of them are microsaccades in this case, in these different configurations. And you can just see that vertical saccades almost never occur unless you make a vertical configuration of the memory items, then you start to see them. And the effect, we think, because you get this horizontal bias in the background, kind of, it's maybe clearer in the diagonal case where you just see more saccades kind of in the configurational axis of the memory item, depending on whether it's tilted to the left or to the right in kind of these two diagonal situations. Now, you can then quantify saccades as being aligned with the configuration or misaligned, and we can see that the delay period here is 3 seconds. This effect doesn't last throughout the full delay period. But it does last for a considerable amount of time, so about 2 seconds or something into the delay period, you can still have a significant biasing of these fixational eye movements according to the configuration of the memory items. And again, we're not asking you to remember the location of the items. It just you happen to rehearse them at their location, and we can see it through the microsaccades. Yeah. Okay. So I want to wrap up here, but then I still want to show you part 3, but it doesn't need a separate take-home message, I think, part 3. So the take-home message, what I've shown you so far, is that the brain system that I've been referred to as oculomotor system that controls where we look also seems to participate, or at least get engaged somehow. Like it executes a role. Its exact role we don't know, but it seems that it's at least active somehow by focusing on specific memory contents. And this leaves robust peripheral traces in the form of these directional biases, microsaccade, that we can measure. And I really try to argue here how this opens new opportunities for us to track selective attention inside memory, both in time and space, as well as perhaps non-invasive readout of the subcortical oculomotor circuitry. It might be useful also maybe in studying individual differences or clinical cases or something. And so here's just a rundown of some of the things we've shown so far. And there's more studies, but I don't have time to show all of them. It seems that these eye movements have seemed to suggest to us that internal selective attention might be subject to both goal and stimulus-driven influences, as I showed in that first study. This looking ahead phenomena I showed in the second study, where you, while you're still guiding your behavior by one memory representation, your brain has already started thinking of the next one that it's going to need, and as uncovered through these temporal dynamics in these eye movement biases. It seems to rely not on one spatial frame necessarily, but on multiple spatial frames. In this case, we studied this in this kind of moving, acting observers or behaving agents, or our participants were rotating. That there might also be kind of spatial reference to both past and future locations. And I talked about this efficient coding, where you care about the direction, the distance only when you need to, and otherwise you just care about direction. And maybe this kind of I'm not sure we should call it internal selective attention in this case, but there might also be some sort of rehearsal mechanism when you're keeping the two items in memory that also engages this kind of oculomotor circuitry for doing that, at least in the first kind of 2 seconds of the trial, or perhaps you're still consolidating the items or something. So that's kind of the empirical summary here. But I'm happy to take questions also before I dive to the final part. Or it's all clear? Okay, let me just do this and then we can do a general discussion. So now we have shown in this kind of case where there's no real incentive, it looks, to make eye movements, even though in many of our tasks maybe there is incentive and we tell you not to do it. So the incentive from the from the experimenter is say, please don't make eye movements, look at the fixation cross. But even when you don't have an incentive to look elsewhere because there's nothing on the screen and the cue happens centrally and everything happens central, that you still get these systematic biases in gaze position. And that is potentially a problem for a lot of our cognitive neuroscience experiments, where maybe fixation is important so we know where things land on the retina and then we can study neural modulations, visual cortex or something. And so, so now what do we do, right? So fortunately we have one data set where we were able to look at least in one of our studies at the relation between this microsaccade bias and the attentional modulation that we found in EEG signals. That's the elephant in the room. Kind of like these microsaccades have been known to be modulated by cognition for 20 years at least, probably 50 years. But kind of most of us think is maybe not the big problem because it's just noise or something. But as some of my studies and many other people's studies have shown, they're not only noise, there's systematic biases in these things. So fortunately in this task, and that was actually one of the reasons we set up the experiment in the first place, we were interested in the neural dynamics of selecting these contents from memory, and in that particular case in both visual and motor selection, and we showed that kind of the items that you could access simultaneously the visual representation and the action plan associated with it, and that was kind of the point of that paper. But as part of the visual selection, we have this very clear modulation of an EEG signal that's canonically implicated in shifting of covert attention and also holding things in spatial locations in memory, which is the lateralization of alpha band activity. Sorry, the color map is missing here, but this is a relative suppression, contralateral relative to ipsilateral, relative to the target memory location, and this is a topography showing the difference between left and right. And so not only do we have these biases in microsaccades, we also have clear EEG signals that are tracking our attentional state, again in this context where there's nothing on the screen there. So now we have the opportunity to say, okay, is this then explained by the microsaccades? Is there some sort of consequence of it, or is it more interesting, more complicated? So yeah, the question is how are these things related? And again, I'm just going to show you one study that we did, but we should probably do more. So the first step, I showed you this graph already because it came from that paper. The first step was, let's try to sort our trials by the eye movements. The nice thing of the eye movements is that they're discrete events. Unlike the EEG signal is kind of continuous waving up and down. The eye movements, if we detect them properly, are made or not made, and they're made to the left or to the right. So kind of you can sort your trials based on them quite well. And so what we did is we took this window from 200 to 600, where on average that's where we find the more saccades towards than away, and we just sorted the trials. And so here's the participants. So the trial sorting ends up with different proportions in different participants, but you can kind of appreciate that we have toward trials. So a trial where the first microsaccade that we detect in this window is made in the direction of the focused memory item. We have away trials where actually the first microsaccade we detect is in the opposite direction, which happens. The measure is not perfect, right? And then there's trials where we think we didn't detect the microsaccade. Of course, ultimately this is a signal-to-noise problem. We set deliberately quite low threshold for finding the microsaccade so that even some noise might tip into misclassifying as a saccade, even though it was just noise. Just so we want to be sure that the no microsaccade trials, we really think they are no microsaccade trials. Because those are the critical trials to address the question we have here. But that makes sense, the logic? So the first finding is that the microsaccade direction is going to matter. Okay, so here is the trials with the toward saccades, and here is the trials with the away saccades. So you can already see that ultimately we still find the same alpha modulation in this particular case, or neural modulation by attention, but the effect's quite different. And if you overlay them, you can see that the shading doesn't come out so well here, but you can see that there is a difference. That the effect seems to be delayed and maybe initially in the wrong direction, and it's definitely much weaker. Okay, so suggesting that something about the attentional deployment that we measure in the EEG correlates with the attentional deployment that we can measure in the eye movements, because when the eye movement go in correct direction, the EEG modulation is much cleaner and much sharper, much more robust, and much earlier. So then we thought, okay, that's just the direction of the microsaccade. What about the latency? So here is trials where we just look at only the toward microsaccade trials, and we sorted them by early or late. So in this window from 2 to 600, we only look at saccades in this window. We have trials where you make the microsaccade earlier or later, and this is based on a median split per participant. But because different people have different distributions, the median split doesn't work out in the average. But I can assure you that for every single subject, we have early and late, and there is no overlap in early and late. Okay, so now the question is whether those trials where the microsaccade suggests that you're shifting attention early are also trials where the EEG signal is shifted early compared to late. And so that's exactly what we found. So, and we did some latency analysis and so on. So, but I hope you can appreciate also just looking at the graph that the peaks, they peak later, the halfway they peak, that's what we quantified at the end, is also later. So in the early trials, the alpha lateralization also is earlier. And in the late trials, alpha lateralization also is later. So again, the microsaccade and the neuromodulation are correlated not only in terms of direction, but also in terms of latency. But the critical insight is that the microsaccade are not necessary for the alpha modulation. So here's the toward trials, and here's the no microsaccade trials. And so this is really good news, I guess, for a lot of us, at least interested in studying these neuromodulations. You can qualitatively measure the same thing in cases where at least we think there was actually no microsaccade. So it suggests that the microsaccade not driving the neuromodulation. It's just that when you do make a microsaccade, its properties are correlated with the attention process, and so is the EEG signal, and that's why they are correlated in terms of direction and latency. It's just that they're like two reflections of the same process, which is the attention shift. So here, if you overlay them, you can see actually it's very beautiful preserved neuromodulation without the microsaccade. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that in all of your studies this is also fine, right? So this is a bit the problem of this. Unless you do this analysis, you won't know if the no microsaccade trials are that the signal is preserved. Like it's preserved in this task, but maybe in your data set might be driven by microsaccade. Who knows? Yeah. So I don't have a conclusion on the last part, but I hope it was clear enough. Let me thank everybody. So this is my lab in Amsterdam. In particular, I showed, I think, a lot of work from Byway. It's been one of the leading forces on this line of research, and also Ilke. And a lot of this research was done when I was a postdoc with Kian Ober, who was at that time still in Oxford. She moved to Yale in the United States recently. But anyways, I had 5 years in her lab, and all of this kind of started there. And Sami, Giovanna, Dejan, and Alex were involved in the studies I showed. So, thank you.
An extraordinary series of publications based on this finding. So, as is traditional, someone who needs to leave can do so now, and then we'll have some questions. Even if you leave now, you can still come later to the club. We're going to go to the pint shop at about 6. We'll be in the front of the building, and your first drink will be on the department.
That's pretty good. Okay. We'll just give it a moment. I was checking, how am I doing with time?
Oh, that was perfect. Yeah.
That was kind of 1 hour?
Yeah.
Okay. Very well. That means everybody is left has a question. No. Who wants to know the questions of the others? Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay, we start?
Yeah.
Yeah?
You
Okay.
You take the word.
Yeah, you had a question, right? So.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on Hannah's question
Yeah.
about the functional significance
Yeah.
of these microsaccades. Did
Yeah.
you find any evidence that, say, the people who have them,
Yeah.
and once you make them, if they help you in performance area?
But it's kind of like that last study I showed. So when you make the saccades, they do tend to correlate with effective employment of attention. And then they also make you better. So I have a slide here. So this is the same trial sorting that we just did with toward, no, and away from the same data set. And so it's small, but in error, if you made a microsaccade toward, you are better than when you made a microsaccade away. Okay? But this is a very small effect. And again, the no microsaccade is kind of in the middle because it doesn't really tell us about how effective you apply the tension. Likewise, if you do early versus late, which I also showed you, those trials with the early microsaccade end up trials where you end up reporting faster.
Do you know
Yeah.
if they mediate the performance, or just the performance is just like the EEG is a correlate?
Yeah. Yeah, so what we also did is an experiment where we jumped the fixation cross to kind of make you make the microsaccade. If that makes sense. So we impose some sort of eye movement because the fixation cross jumps a little bit. That has little to no effect on performance. But that is also not the same type of microsaccade that we here. But in a more general sense, I think for us it's really been a signal, like a readout of what's happening in the oculomotor system and a way to track attention over time and through space. Yeah.
Does it really track attention, or is it some kind of like epiphenomena? Like, does it have any functional significance then?
So it clearly tracks attention because it's what I showed. But attention doesn't drive the microsaccade. So this is a study I can briefly show. So because this relates to the point of it being correlated with attention, but not necessary for attention. So if you do, here's a task where we added a neutral cue. So the neutral cue is just a different color, which can be a cue in another trial because there is that color in memory. But in this trial, orange is not in memory, so it serves as a neutral. So when the cue is informative, you clearly get a bias in the microsaccade, like I've shown you. But actually, the overall rate of microsaccade is not increased. So, relative to the neutral in this case. So what that means is that attention is not triggering a new microsaccade. It's not like attention itself is not driving the microsaccade. What it's doing is it's biasing the direction of a microsaccade that you would have made anyways. So you make these fixational eye movements all the time. It's just that their direction is for us a way to read out what you're attending to in your mind. And the reasoning, I think, is that the oculomotor system is engaged somehow in the shifting attention, including in memory, and it can't help but to overspill into measurable effects in the periphery, which in this case are microsaccades. But the microsaccades themselves, I don't think have a functional. They're not necessary. That's what the data show, and the eye movement itself, I don't think in our case is functional. In general, perception might be functional, but there's a whole, that's a whole different question. Yeah, does it make sense? Okay. Yeah, I'll take some more questions. Yeah.
Have you considered studying this in any disorders where you see nystagmus, where you have constant sort of a high horizontal left or right beating eye movement?
Yeah. No.
Because where the oculomotor system isn't necessarily affected, but that's governed by the vestibular system.
Yeah. No, we have not done anything clinical. I mean, we're quite keen to also test this in ADHD on development or aging, what have you. Because maybe it's also a nice way to track, like, what is it about attentional problems in ADHD? Is it delayed initiation, or can't they sustain, or is it like too diffuse in space, or what's going on? So, but we haven't. No, there is one paper I think that they measured something like this in people that can't make horizontal eye movements. Like there is a specific disorder, which is very rare, I think, and they can still have like cueing benefits from cues that direct to left and right memory.
I mean, the nystagmus are actually quite common in many neurological disorders. But
Yeah, I'm talking about a different disorder where you really just can't make eye movements like this. But yeah, no, we haven't, but it's a good point. Yeah, Alex?
Two questions. One's a more boring methods question, the other one might be more interesting. But the methods one is, so it's really nice that you show even when you can't detect the microsaccades, you still have your EEG effects.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering in terms of like how worried we should be in general.
I'm worried. Yeah.
I mean, obviously those correlations are worrying, but then I wondered, like, what is the explanation? Like, how do we think that eye movements end up in alpha? Like, I understand obviously you're changing the visual input, moving your eyes, but are they going at alpha frequency? Like, why do they have a specific effect in the alpha band?
Well, no, our modulation is in the alpha band, like the attentional deployment happens in the alpha band. And then at the same time, we kind of have an eye movement and stuff. But you could also do that analysis for N2PC, CDA, any other signal, which we should probably do at some point. But regarding how worried we should be, what we also did, which I didn't show, was this. In the delay period, right, you make these microsaccades randomly, because there's nothing to select yet. But every time you make one and we detect these high velocity things, we align the data. It's crazy nobody has done this, actually, because we've known this forever. Well, we think nobody did it before us, or one or two people maybe, but nothing was really published seriously. Anyway, we align the data to the microsaccade. We just say whether the microsaccade left or right, that's all. And we do alpha lateralization, and you get beautiful alpha lateralization. Very transient though, it's like 150 milliseconds, it's like one cycle or so. But it looks exactly like you would want to find it in a spatial attention task or something. So now if your microsaccades are modulated by, let's say, the spatial configuration of your stimuli, then so is going to be all these neural signals, just because they are driving. And now why they're driving it, that's a good question.
Well,
Yeah.
that's the heart of the question, like, because if it's
Yeah.
attention driving both,
Yeah.
it's fine. Like,
Yeah, so here's probably not attention because then, well, here.
maybe the attention's wandering.
So we're doing this experiment actually right now where we just, there is no task, you just look at the fixation cross. Or you do it in the dark, because again, if with a fixation cross, you make an eye movement, the fixation cross moves over your retina, so that might be driving this. I think in the dark it will still happen, to be honest. I think we're still going to see that. Because you still make these small saccades if you just look at the dark, in the dark. Eye tracking still works. So, but yeah, we don't know the answer to that yet, but that's going to make us even more worried, perhaps. Yeah.
The other question I had, if I may, is
Yeah.
about the time course of the effect. So it's really cool that you have a way to track it like through time.
Yeah.
And then I was thinking about working memory literature and this observation that we can for a while decode the content of working memory, and then it appears to disappear
Yeah.
out of our neuroimaging signals,
Yeah, yeah.
but obviously it's still in their brain because they can
Yeah.
the task. So I just wondered whether your microsaccades track, which bit of that do they track? Like, do they
Yeah.
continue right through your response, or do they fade off as well?
No, so in the delay period, which mostly we haven't looked at so much, I show here. That doesn't look so different from decoding the stimulus identity or something. Also, by the way, we're not the first to show that microsaccades track like the stimulus that you're holding in mind. We're showing here that it's tracking the rehearsal between the two stimuli, which maybe is more new. But so yeah, I mean,
It'd be
I don't know.
interesting to put that alongside some decoding.
Yeah, or
and they're tracking each other.
exactly, and also CDA or something normally dies off over time, even though the memory is still there. So, yeah. In fact, we've done this experiment with even much longer delay. And then we're asking whether, if you queue one of the items, whether the fact that this disappears means that you have forgotten the spatial location, you have recoded it or something. But actually, when you queue one of the items, the selection bias stayed preserved. So you still know the spatial location, you just didn't use it anymore in the neural signal. Or in the, sorry, this is not even a neural, this is the eye movement signal. Yeah. Yeah, I'm happy, yeah, maybe.
Do you know if you need visual encoding to see this relationship?
Yeah, I get this question a lot. And we've done one experiment with auditory stimuli. And so they were presented left and right, either in headphones, which might be different, or in speakers, which you can kind of see. It didn't work for us, but we couldn't translate our task so efficiently into an auditory version. So we have two features here, color and orientation, and we use, I think, pitch and loudness or something. And then you have to report back the loudness given the pitch or something like that. So that didn't work, but I think some other people are trying this currently because they were talking to me about it, and exactly from the perspective of let's go beyond vision. I think if it had a spatial component, why not? Yeah, but I don't know. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
I also have a question still about sort of fixation cross. Did all your studies have fixation cross? Because I remember some study also looking at different modes, like different ways of keeping fixation, and that the fixation cross also biases kind of the direction of the microsaccade.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like at VSS, there's whole talks about what's the best fixation cross and stuff. And there is indeed fixation crosses that lead to less fixation of gaze behavior, like the one that has a bunch of distractors and then nothing in the middle, kind of like. We have done it without a fixation cross, and we tested it with 5-6 people, and then we knew the answer. It's still there. We had no fixation cross, and then we just flashed the whole screen green or purple, so there was no. And people still saccaded left or right depending on the memory item. But what was different was that they didn't saccade back. So if you have fixation cross, you saccade based on attention, and then you realize, oh, I'm not fixating, and then you go back. If there's no fixation cross, you don't have that anchor, and you actually don't realize that you've shifted attention or shifted your eyes to the right, and you just stay in the new location. So yeah, and some of these experiments with the dot, some with the cross. At some point we did like big, small. It doesn't really matter, I think. Yeah. Okay.
I have two questions. One is a bit weird, the other one is hopefully more interesting.
Okay.
let's start with the maybe more interesting. The moment you cue,
Yeah.
And then maybe the person has to, do this and then that. So you have now instruction of two things holding working memory.
Uh-huh.
The one you had, show go one way, the other way,
Mm-hmm.
faster. Do you think it would work if you have, electromyography and make the people close their eyes as soon as they see the cue, for example?
Oh, yeah.
Because the idea that now the people don't rely on the visual information that it says, right? Just close your eyes. Now it's your mind's eye.
Yeah.
Truly internal attention.
Yeah.
If you want to,
Yeah, it's just
yield the. Because I don't care if there's more noise. I just want to see if this happens.
We thought about doing that for the dark project that I was just saying to Alex. Like, in the dark, the best dark is just close your eyes, but then we still need to measure the eye movements. So, but you're saying we give you the cue, but you wouldn't be able to close your eyes within 200 minutes. Well, maybe, I don't know. It would take about the same time, but then we wouldn't be able to measure indeed the eye tracking signal. We might be able to measure some sort of like rotation of the eyeball in the EOG. Yeah, we haven't done it, but it could be a fun experiment.
Yeah. My thinking was towards the idea of whether that is more a purer version of attention, and then then the eyes still show that.
I mean, better would be to have your eyes.
Attentional echo.
Yeah, I see. Right? Better would be to have your eyes closed already, and then use an auditory cue or something.
Yeah, that was my second follow up on that, not the weird one.
Okay. And the weird one?
I'll do the simple weird one.
Okay.
Which would be the one that was suggested about the nystagmus or the dark one, but directly with injecting this type of thing.
Freezing the eyes?
Freeze the eyes. You have a pupil problem with the freeze the eyes, but it's the sort of like a nice disruption of the physiological effect, and then see if, if the other parameters are.
But the way I see it really is that we are measuring the downstream consequence of something happening inside the brain, really. And you might freeze the eye muscles, but the superior colliculus will probably still be able to participate in attention. So I don't expect that it will have a huge effect on task performance.
Hopefully not. Hopefully the eye movement is just an echo.
Yeah, it's an echo.
A true central process, although the eyes are evolutionary central nervous system.
Yeah. So in the looking at nothing kind of phenomena, I can kind of imagine that you look to the thing as a retrieval cue or something. Then the eye movement itself might really be effective. In my case, really, I don't think people have also no idea that they're doing this, right? They're like, no, they have no idea. So, I think the eye movement itself is really not necessary, but this is a readout for us. Yeah, I mean, some people are dissatisfied with the answer, I realize, but I don't personally mind. Like EEG is also a readout; it's also not a perfect signal, or fMRI or whatever. So, yeah.
On this topic, sorry, it's on the same topic. So, do we actually know that covert attention is being directed alongside these microsaccades? I mean, you talk about internal attention, a measure of internal attention. Are people actually covertly attending the patch of space that the relevant object was in?
So we did an experiment where we left the items on the screen. And then people start to sometimes make big eye movements to the items. Not so surprising. But those same people with the same instruction and everything, when the items are not there, they don't do that. Suggesting that there is some differences between covert, externally directed attention and this internally directed attention. But, I mean, for me, it's an orienting signal, right? So you are orienting to one memory item and not the others. So you can call that covert attention or orienting. I mean, there's just many ways to describe it.
But it seems to be spatial, right?
So
about space in the world.
Yeah. What? Yeah. Well, at least our data shows directional, and then when this competition is more than just directional. But we haven't done, for example, like flash a dot at that location and see if you're faster to detect it. But then, that might be an interesting thing to do. I think Amte was actually in my department, had done something like this at some point where you cue the yellow thing and then do a dot probe at the location where the thing was, you're faster. But if that's contingent on the eye movement and stuff, could be an interesting new twist to the story. Yeah, I don't know. It's a good point.
trying to ask in not such good words.
Okay.
It's like because you have this microsaccade, it's like a spillover of a system.
Yeah.
If you had found something else, some other physiological signal,
Yeah.
like change in breathing,
Yeah.
or your belly was gurgling in a different
Uh-huh.
way, that could also be the result of attention, but you wouldn't say it's attending in your mind's eye, which is or internal attention. Like you're thinking about it as some kind of something that happens in the mind. But what evidence we have that it can really indicate something that happens in the mind? That's what I'm trying to crack.
Well, the location of the memory item is in the mind. There's no incentive for you to look at the location except that it's the memory. It happens to be the location of the memory item you're focusing on. So in that sense, kind of by definition, is in the mind. But or by the way we set up our task.
But the microsaccade may just be correlated as much as a stomach gurgle could be correlated.
And if the stomach thing was had a good time in spatial resolution and stuff, I'd be happy to study it. Yeah, why not? I mean, and the same people study a pupil or whatever. Like, I mean, it's just a signal for us, really. But quite useful signal. Yeah.
Oh, a very boring one.
Okay.
You're presenting colour stimuli for a quarter of a second on a white field.
Oh, sorry. Normally the background is grey. This is just the schematics of the tasks, just to kind of. The background in the real experiments is grey.
Well, there's no such thing as a grey background. I mean,
Okay.
if there's nothing else in the field, it's a white background. I mean, you just tell them you've got a blank field of a certain luminance.
Yeah, exactly.
It'll look white.
Yeah,
If it's on its own, and it'll look grey if there's something brighter in the field.
Yeah.
But it's even worse if it's grey, because then you present brighter, I take it.
Yeah.
Coloured stimuli.
I think we've done both, really. We've never really paid attention too much to it. Yeah.
Well, the question is, how long does the after image last?
Yeah, that's a good point. We haven't measured it, but for example, there is things like studies like this one where you rotate 90 degrees. There is no after. Well, maybe in the VR goggles, who knows? Or this one. By the time you're switching, like this, is like 2-3 seconds later, you've done all kinds of stuff on the monitor, and we still measure that, right? So.
As I recollect those experiments as you were describing them, there is still some component that's towards the original stimulus as well as the new component.
Yeah. So what we haven't done carefully, I agree with you, is mask the stimuli and so that get rid of whatever the after image or present new after images that are totally irrelevant to you or something. Mm-hmm. But I don't think these effects are because of some after image. We've also done it with 5-6 seconds after you've encoded it, and it's perfectly preserved just like 1 second after encoding. So it's not that time dependent relative to encoding. But it has played on my mind as well, certainly at the beginning when we had only the first few studies, whether we needed to be more careful in masking the stimuli and stuff. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah?
So just if I may follow up on that, I was just wondering if your stimuli, rather than just move behind an occluder, so that the person still represented them as being there, but they never appeared on the screen.
Yeah.
That would get rid of that immediate problem, at least, the low field after that. And you might well, I think I might well still make attention shifts to that location.
So this thing is kind of a version of that. We don't have an occluder, but the future location has never had a stimulus, and you still saccade there. So.
Oh, does it not? So it doesn't move there at all? It's simply
No, it's just there, and it will be tested there, but it's a static stimulus. It's just implied motion, kind of.
maybe that.
Yeah, this is a way of getting at your question as well, I guess.
Yeah, but as we understand, there is still a component
Of the past as well, yeah.
that goes to the past.
Yeah. But that component is also there 6 seconds after encoding, which I'm quite sure the monitor will have gotten rid of the after image. But yeah.
Okay, let's thank Frank again.
Okay. You know, this format is not bad because at the beginning I think, why is everybody leaving? But actually the people that stay really are interested in discussion, and you can go, but it's quite nice for the speaker, I think. Yeah, thank you.